Keith Richards used open G tuning for years, like a signature, like proof. He offered it to Jimi as a challenge, casual, almost friendly. Jimi touched the strings once, and Keith went silent for 20 seconds. London. Early spring, 1969. A rehearsal space above a pub in Chelsea. The kind of room where paint peeled from the walls and the floorboards creaked under every step. No windows. One bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. 2 amplifiers pushed against opposite walls. Wooden chairs that didn't match. The smell of cigarette smoke and old wood. Keith Richards sat in one of those chairs, his Telecaster resting across his lap. He'd been playing for the past hour, working through a riff, refining something for the Stones' next session. His fingers moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Open G tuning. The tuning he'd made his own. The tuning that defined his sound. Jimi Hendrix sat across from him, maybe 6 feet away, on a low stool. His Stratocaster leaned against his knee. He wasn't playing. He was listening. His eyes were half closed, his head tilted slightly, following the notes Keith was pulling from the Telecaster. They'd met through mutual friends an hour ago. Someone had suggested they jam. Keith had agreed immediately, eager, maybe, to share space with the man everyone called the greatest guitarist alive. Jimi had simply nodded. Now Keith finished his riff. The last note hung in the air for a moment before fading. He looked up at Jimi, a slight smile on his face. Open G, Keith said, tapping the body of his guitar. Tuned it down years ago. Makes everything, I don't know, easier. More honest. He paused. You ever try it? Jimmy's eyes opened slowly. He looked at Keith, then at the Stratocaster beside him. No, he said quietly. Never needed to. Keith's smile widened slightly. Not mocking. Just confident. You should try it. Changes everything. Makes you think different. There was something in Keith's tone. Not quite a challenge. Not quite friendly advice. Something in between. An offering that carried weight. An invitation that suggested, I know something you don't. Jimi reached for his guitar. His movements were slow, deliberate. He lifted the Stratocaster and settled it across his lap. His fingers found the tuning pegs. Keith watched, still smiling. Need help with it? No, Jimi said again. His fingers moved across the pegs with precision. 30 seconds later, the guitar was in open G. He didn't check it twice. He didn't strum to verify. He just knew. Keith leaned back in his chair, gesturing with one hand. Go ahead. Try something. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Jimmy's right hand moved to the strings. His left hand positioned itself on the fretboard. He paused for maybe 2 seconds, not hesitation, just preparation. Like a breath before speaking. Then he played. Not a riff. Not a phrase. Just one note. But the way he played it, the way his fingers pressed into the string, the way his right hand drew the sound from the guitar, the way the note bent and sustained and seemed to contain more information than a single note should be able to hold. It wasn't music anymore. It was language. It was a complete thought expressed without words. The note filled the small room. It pushed against the walls. It made the bare bulb seem to flicker even though it didn't. It made the air itself feel denser. Keith's smile faded. Jimi let the note decay naturally. He didn't rush to the next one. He waited. Let the silence return. Then he played another note. Different pitch. Same impossible depth. Same sense that the guitar wasn't being played so much as translated. Keith's hands, which had been resting casually on his Telecaster, went still. His fingers spread flat against his thighs. Jimi played a third note. Then a fourth. Not a melody. Not a riff. Just individual statements. Each one complete. Each one saying something Keith could feel but couldn't articulate. And then Jimi began to move through the open G tuning the way Keith had never heard anyone move through it. Not faster. Not flashier. Just different. Deeper. Like Jimi had looked at the same landscape Keith had been exploring for years and immediately seen dimensions Keith hadn't known existed. The progression wasn't complex. 6 notes. Maybe 7. Played over the course of 15 seconds. But in those 15 seconds, Keith Richards understood something he hadn't wanted to understand. He didn't own Open G. He'd never owned it. He'd just been borrowing it. And now he was watching the owner come home. Jimi stopped. The last note faded. Silence returned to the room, but it was different now. Heavier. The kind of silence that follows a statement no one can argue with. Keith sat perfectly still. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were fixed on Jimi's hands, still resting on the Stratocaster's strings. 20 seconds passed. Neither man moved. Neither man spoke. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand what Open G meant to Keith Richards. He'd discovered the tuning years earlier, or rediscovered it, really. Blues players had used it for decades. But Keith had made it his signature. He'd built entire songs around it. Honky Tonk Women. Start Me Up. Brown Sugar. The tuning wasn't just a technical choice. It was part of his identity as a guitarist. Part of how he understood himself. When you spend years mastering something, when you built your sound around it, when people recognize you because of it, it became more than technique. It became territory. And Keith had been defending that territory, consciously or not, for a long time. He'd never quite articulated it that way. But when someone suggested he try standard tuning, he'd dismiss it with a wave. When interviewers asked about his approach, he'd talk about Open G like it was a philosophy, not just a tuning. And now Jimi Hendrix, who never used it, who never needed it, had picked up a guitar, tuned it to Open G for the first time, and within 30 seconds had played notes Keith didn't know the tuning could make. Not because Jimi was faster. Not because he was louder. But because Jimi approached the guitar without ownership. Without territory. Without the need to prove the tuning belonged to him. Keith had offered Open G as a challenge. Look what I can do with this. Try to match it. And Jimi had responded without ego. This isn't yours. This isn't mine. This just is. And here's what it can say if you stop trying to own it. The silence in the room stretched to 30 seconds. Then 40. Finally Keith spoke. His voice was quiet, stripped of the casual confidence it had carried before. How did you? He stopped. Started again. You've never played Open G before? No, Jimi said. He was looking down at the guitar, his fingers still resting on the strings. Not admiring them. Just being with them. But you just... Keith gestured vaguely at the Stratocaster. You just did things with it I've been trying to figure out for years. Jimi lifted his head slightly. His eyes met Keith's. There was no triumph in them. No satisfaction. Just a kind of gentle acknowledgement. It's the same 6 strings, he said quietly. Just arranged different. The music doesn't change. Just how you listen to it. Keith looked down at his own guitar. The Telecaster he'd played 10,000 times. The instrument he knew better than he knew most people. And for the first time in years, it felt unfamiliar. Like he'd been speaking the language his entire life, and had just realized he'd only learned half the words. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Jimi reached down and carefully retuned the Stratocaster back to standard tuning. His movements were unhurried. Methodical. When he finished, he looked up at Keith. Play something for me, Jimi said. In your tuning. The way you hear it. Keith hesitated. The request felt strange. Almost like Jimi was offering him back something that had been taken away, except nothing had been taken. It had just been revealed as never owned in the first place. I don't. Keith started then stopped. He picked up his Telecaster. His fingers found the strings. He started to play the riff he'd been working on before Jimi arrived, the one in open G that he'd been so confident about an hour ago. But now his fingers felt clumsy. The notes that had seemed perfect before sounded thin. Incomplete. He could hear the space around them now, the space Jimi had just shown him existed. The dimensions he'd never noticed. He stopped after 8 bars. The riff dissolved into silence. "It's good," Jimi said simply. No irony. No consolation. Just observation. "It's not what you just did," Keith said. "It's not supposed to be." Jimi adjusted the Stratocaster on his lap, his fingers moving to the fretboard. "You want to know what I heard when you played?" Keith nodded, not trusting his voice. Jimi played Keith's riff back to him. But he didn't copy it. He played it the way Keith had intended it, before Keith had known what his intention was. He found the ghost notes Keith had been reaching for without realizing it. He emphasized the spaces Keith had been trying to fill. He made Keith's riff sound the way Keith had heard it in his head before his fingers translated it into something smaller. When Jimi finished, he let the guitar rest against his knee. "That's what you're trying to say," he said quietly. "You're almost there. You just have to stop defending it." Keith stared at him. "Defending it?" "The tuning. The sound. The way you think it should be." Jimmy's voice was gentle, almost meditative. "When you stop defending, you start discovering." The words hung in the air between them. Keith wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that he wasn't defending anything, he was just. But he couldn't finish the thought. Because Jimi was right. He had been defending. Every time he dismissed standard tuning. Every time he talked about open G like it was his innovation. Every time he approached the guitar like it was territory instead of language. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. They played together for another hour. Not trading solos. Not competing. Just exploring. Jimi would play something. Keith would respond. Keith would try a phrase. Jimi would show him where it could go. There were moments when Keith forgot about the tuning entirely. Forgot about technique. Forgot about defending anything. He just played. And in those moments, the guitar felt different in his hands. Not unfamiliar, but less constrained. Like he'd been holding it wrong his entire life and someone had just shown him a more comfortable grip. When they finally stopped, it was past midnight. The bare bulb still hung from the ceiling, casting the same pale light. The paint still peeled from the walls. But something in the room had changed. Keith set his Telecaster down carefully. He looked at Jimi, who was already packing his Stratocaster into its case. "Thank you," Keith said. The words felt inadequate. But they were all he had. Jimi nodded. He didn't smile. Didn't offer platitudes. Just acknowledged the thanks with a slight dip of his head. "Will you?" Keith paused. "Will you play like that in front of people? That way you played open G?" Jimi closed his guitar case. "No," he said quietly. "That was just for you." "Why?" Jimi looked at him directly. "Because you needed to hear it. Not them." Keith never spoke publicly about that night. But 3 weeks later, when the Rolling Stones went into the studio to record, Keith approached open G differently. Less like a signature. More like a conversation. The engineers noticed. The other band members noticed. The songs that came from those sessions had a different quality, something harder to define. Something more open. Years later, after Jimi's death, Keith was asked in an interview about guitarists who had influenced him. He listed the usual names. Then he paused. "There was one night," he said, his voice distant, "where someone showed me I didn't know my own guitar. Not really. And he did it without saying much. Just played. Made me realize that mastery isn't about owning technique. It's about not needing to." The interviewer asked who it was. Keith smiled, not the confident smile from that Chelsea rehearsal room. A quieter smile. A grateful one. Doesn't matter, he said. What matters is I listened. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. In that small room above a pub in Chelsea, with peeling paint and a single bare bulb, Keith Richards learned something that would stay with him forever. Mastery isn't ownership. Years later, Keith kept a photo on his studio wall. Not of himself. Not of the Stones. Just an empty wooden chair in an empty room. That's where I sat, he told a friend once. The night I stopped defending and started listening. Jimi never mentioned that night to anyone. He didn't need to. What happened in that room wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about transmission. One musician showing another that the guitar doesn't belong to anyone. It just waits for those humble enough to listen. Keith Richards still plays open G. But he plays it differently now. Less like territory. More like a language he's still learning to speak. And every time he tunes down, somewhere in his memory, he hears 20 seconds of silence. The silence after Jimi played 6 notes that changed everything. The silence when ego left the room and music remained.